The ocean is a vast and mysterious place where for centuries people have been drawn to. And with so much life and wonder just underneath the water's surface, it's easy to see how people can become enamored with the ocean and everything it has to offer. However, the ocean also holds dangers, which, if caught by them, are likely to leave a person scarred for life, if not worse, which is exactly what happened to the man in this story. The Farallone Islands are a group of islands and sea stacks in the Gulf of the Farallones, off the coast of San Francisco, California. Also referred to as the Devil's Teeth Islands by mariners, these islands are home to many treacherous underwater shoals. The islands lie 30 miles outside the Golden Gate, which is a strait on the west coast of North America that connects San Francisco Bay to the Pacific Ocean. And on a clear day, they are visible from the mainland. This is as close to the islands that people are able to get, as they are a designated national wildlife refuge, meaning that they are closed to the public. The only ones who are allowed on the islands are researchers and scientists who study the ecosystems and wildlife that inhabit them. The islands were given their protective status in 1974. Additionally, waters surrounding the islands are also protected as part of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. However, these islands and the waters surrounding them weren't always under government care. Before the protection status was introduced, people were able to venture onto the islands and swim in the waters nearby. Whilst who was allowed on the islands might have changed over the decades, the types of animals which frequented the sea around them have remained largely the same. For decades, the islands have been home to animals such as seals, sea lions, and a variety of different fish. This makes it a prime location for predators such as the great white shark to hunt in, as there is plenty of food for them to catch. In 2021, an exhaustive new study concluded that there were nearly 300 adult and subadult great white sharks living between Monterey Bay, the Farallone Islands, and Bodega Bay, an area sometimes called the Red Triangle. Subadult sharks are not fully mature, but still big enough to eat seals, sea lions, and other marine mammals. It is difficult to know how many great whites were around the islands at the time of this story, which took place in the 1960s. However, it is safe to assume that there were still quite a few, which could pose as a danger to anyone swimming nearby. Unfortunately for one man, he discovered just how dangerous it was the hard way. Leroy French had lived in San Francisco his whole life. Throughout his childhood, the one thing that he had always enjoyed the most was being out in the ocean. Whether it was swimming in the water or fishing with his dad on a boat, there was something about the beautiful blue water which captivated Leroy. As he got older, he decided to take scuba diving lessons so that he could become a fully qualified diver. Whilst doing these lessons, he became friends with a man called Al Giddings. Together, the two opened up their very own scuba shop, where they also offered lessons and day excursions into the ocean. One day, in 1962, 24-year-old Leroy and Al agreed to lead a group of 30 members of the Mighty Skin Divers Club on a one-day spearfishing excursion. It would be good money to take that many people out, and it would hopefully be a fun and memorable day. However, it turned out to be memorable for all of the wrong reasons. To begin with, Al and Leroy went through all of the safety rules with the group and made sure everyone knew how the equipment worked. Once this was done, the two men took their boat and the group of 30 out to sea. The area where they were diving was quite close to the middle Farallone Island. Looking forward to spending some time in the area, Leroy got suited up. He wore a black wetsuit, swim fins, a weighted belt, and a mask. He also had triple scuba tanks painted yellow, an orange flotation vest, his camera, and spear gun. Ready to dive, Leroy and the rest of the group entered the water at around 11:30 a.m. Leroy spent roughly an hour diving into the water and taking as many photographs of marine wildlife as he could. When he surfaced from his last dive, he found himself roughly 25 meters down current from another diver who had speared a fish that was oozing plenty of blood. Not thinking much of it, Leroy began making his way back to the boat when, out of nowhere, a shark darted towards him. The great white acted quickly and clamped down on Leroy's left forearm with its razor-sharp teeth. With a mouth made up of 7 rows of serrated 2.5-inch long teeth, Leroy was lucky not to lose his arms straight away. Not wanting to let its prey get away, the shark began shaking Leroy violently from side to side. The animal was aiming to separate the man's arm from his body. Despite the agony that he was in, Leroy was able to stay conscious long enough for the shark to let his arm go. Seeing an opportunity, the 24-year-old tried to find some way to make it back to the boat alive. However, the great white wasn't finished with him yet. After letting his arm go, the shark circled Leroy before once again attacking him. This time it bit down on Leroy's right buttock, making it impossible for him to try and swim away or kick out. Whilst this was happening, several of the divers who Leroy had taken out that day noticed what was going on. One of these divers was Leroy's friend and business partner, Al Giddings. Having seen the shark's tail slapping the surface of the water, Al knew that Leroy was in trouble. Wanting to help his friend out, Al began swimming towards Leroy and the shark. Meanwhile, the shark was still attempting to make a meal out of Leroy. Seeing that its attack on Leroy's right buttock wasn't dealing enough damage to its prey, the shark let him go only to clamp down on his left thigh. This time, with the appendage in its grasp, the shark began to pull Leroy under the water. The animal got roughly 5 meters down, all the while twisting and biting down on Leroy's leg with a bite force of almost 4,000 psi. Full of adrenaline, Leroy wasn't giving up quite so easily. The 24-year-old knew that he only had one chance to save himself. So with this in mind, he took his spear gun, which he had managed to hold onto throughout the entire attack, and began jabbing at the shark's face. After 4 or 5 times of doing this, the great white let Leroy's leg go and swam away. By this time, Al had made it to the spot where he had last seen Leroy before he had been pulled underwater. Fearing the worst, Al was relieved when Leroy popped up to the surface in his inflated life vest, very much alive. Not wasting any time, Al grabbed a hold of Leroy and began pulling him back to the boat. He knew that he needed to act fast in case the shark returned and attacked them again. Thankfully, the two were able to make it back to the boat without any further incidents. Once aboard, Al quickly got to work trying to stop Leroy from bleeding out. The 24-year-old's wounds were severe, and if Al didn't stop the bleeding quickly, it was likely that his friend wouldn't survive. As fast as he could, Al took Leroy's wetsuit off and fashioned a temporary tourniquet from some rope which was lying around. It wasn't long after doing this that emergency services arrived to take Leroy to the hospital. Thankfully, someone had had the forethought to call them whilst the attack was underway. This saved precious time and potentially Leroy's life. The U.S. Coast Guard helicopter transported the injured diver to Harbor Emergency Hospital in San Francisco. When he arrived, Leroy was said to be in a state of shock. This was expected, as his adrenaline had worn off, and the reality of what had happened to him had started to sink in. It took a year of hospital trips and staying out of the water, but Leroy eventually made a full recovery. Not one to let his attack scare him away from the ocean, Leroy went on to own a dive tour operation in St. Martin in the 1980s. He also became an award-winning freelance underwater photographer and videographer. His rescuer and friend, Al Giddings, also achieved fame as an underwater photographer. He also went on to become the lead cinematographer on some of the James Bond movies. Whilst the attack on Leroy was horrific, he was lucky that he had the courage to fight for his life along with the help of his friend to get him to safety. After the attack, experts believe that the shark had not attacked Leroy purposefully. Instead, it was likely that the great white had thought that Leroy was a seal due to the gray wetsuit and swimming fins. Since then, though, swimming in the sea around the Farallon Islands has become very restricted, and it's probably for the best. Being a hunting and breeding ground for great whites, it probably isn't somewhere many of us would want to swim. What happened to Leroy can happen to anyone swimming in the ocean, and it can easily result in us meeting our terrifying final affliction. Hawaii is renowned for its beautiful water and stunning wildlife, making it one of the most popular U.S. states in America and attracting nearly 10 million tourists each year. One particularly popular area is Kahi Point in Oahu, Hawaii's third-largest island, with some of the most diverse snorkeling spots in the state. What makes Kahi Point even more unique is that it is home to a HECO power plant located just off the shoreline with a large underwater pipe used to remove the excess cooling water for the machines. As a result, there is a steady stream of warm salt water being distributed from this pipe, creating a large reef nearby, which is bursting with life such as parrotfish, green turtles, and spinner dolphins. This attracts lots of tourists who want to try snorkeling or scuba diving, allowing them to see these animals in their beautiful natural habitat. Unfortunately, this great diversity of underwater life also attracts other types of animals, ones that would consider those tourists to be its prey. Ray Mel Jr. moved to Hawaii with his wife and 3 children on October 1, 1989, for a new job which offered to pay him much more than his position in Boston. His family were ecstatic, the promise of more money and the beauty of Hawaii making them believe that they would soon have a peaceful and wonderful life. As magical as this all sounds, their hopes would soon be shattered. Just 2 weeks later, 33-year-old Ray arrived at Kahi Point on October 14, 1989, ready to begin his diving adventure with his friend. He was a novice diver, but was gradually gaining more experience as he traveled to different places and learning more from the people around him. It was a great day for diving. The water was warm and the visibility was high, up to about 30 feet. They were excited to see the wildlife in the area and were hoping to be able to spot some of the spinner dolphins who were known to breed nearby. They entered the water with full tanks about 750 feet away from shore. They had been told that they would have to go quite far from the shore as the majority of the beach was very shallow, so they wouldn't be able to see anything until they were much further out. They were now about 27 feet deep, and they could clearly see the sea floor below them, as well as the large pipeline from the power plant. They had been warned to stay away from the pipe itself, as the water shot out at such a high speed that it would cause them to cartwheel uncontrollably, which could lead to a serious accident if they hit something or their masks became dislodged. Armed with the warnings and knowledge to keep themselves safe, the pair descended into the water. They decided not to swim together and separated, hoping to see as much as they wanted to at their own pace. This would prove to be a mistake, as you should always stay with your diving buddy, who can keep an eye on you and alert others if there are any problems. This rule was created to save lives, but the friends still decided against it. Ray began to swim around the reef to see what he could find, and marveled at the schools of fish surrounding him. Suddenly, the fish seemed to disappear, as if they were hiding from something. He saw the parrotfish quickly swim away into the reef for shelter, but he couldn't figure out why. He began to survey his environment, looking for clues as to what had caused the unusual behavior, when he spotted something in the distance getting closer and closer. As he knew the area, he had a good idea of what was coming towards him: a shark. He quickly tried to reach the surface, knowing that he was at a great disadvantage if he stayed in the water. As he ascended, the creature grew bigger and bigger as it swam closer to him. Ray knew he had little time to escape. Suddenly, he felt the tiger shark bite into his torso, digging its teeth deep into his body as he tried to struggle out of its grip. He looked around for something to help him, but there was nothing. He couldn't see his diving buddy or the boat above him, and came to the realization that he was completely alone. The shark continued its attack, tearing into his flesh as it attempted to rip him to pieces. The pain was unimaginable, but he found no way to free himself from the huge mouth of the predator. He began to feel very weak, either from lack of oxygen or blood loss, and quickly lost consciousness, never to wake again. About 15 minutes after the dive began, Ray's diving buddy began to look for him, as he was becoming concerned that he hadn't crossed paths with him in a while, considering how small the area was. He began to circle around, looking around the reef for any sign of him, but he wasn't able to spot him anywhere. Everything seemed normal, aside from some of the parrotfish hiding, although he assumed that he had just spooked them as he circled the reef. He swam back to the surface and alerted the boat crew, who returned to shore to find help. As they alerted the divers on the shore, more people decided to sail out in search of Ray, thinking that he may have simply gotten lost or become disorientated within the reef and would be in need of help. Several boats went in to search of Ray, but to no avail. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Unfortunately, this was not the case, as people would soon realize when they found his grisly remains. The next morning, the search continued. Many fire rescue divers were deployed into the area around where Ray had gone missing, assuming they would either find a body or nothing at all. The reality was much worse than they could have imagined. As they were searching the area, one diver spotted something in the distance and reported it to those around him. As they began to approach, they realized what they were swimming towards: the dismembered body of Ray Male Jr. He was floating just beneath the surface, covered in horrific bite marks. His skin was as white as a ghost due to blood loss. Most notably, his body was missing one of his arms, and his head had been completely bitten off, which could not be seen anywhere near the body. The rescuers called their superiors to report their findings and began to discuss how they would remove the body from the ocean. As they were planning the retrieval, one diver spotted a shark swimming from beneath them, barreling towards them from the depths. They quickly abandoned the body, not planning to be the next meal of this huge tiger shark. They were helpless to do anything but watch as the animal grabbed the body in front of them and devoured it whole, leaving only small pieces of tissue floating in the water. As quickly as it appeared, it disappeared back into the murkiness of the ocean, satisfied with its meal. The divers were horrified by what they had seen and disappointed that they wouldn't be able to take any remains back for Ray's family. They recovered the small pieces of tissue along with some diving equipment floating nearby and returned to shore. The issues continued when the divers came to shore. Even though they were able to bring some remains to the shore, the family would not be soothed by this news. After hearing that her husband was dead and her children were now fatherless, Mrs. Male was beside herself. Due to her own poor health, she was unable to work and had been heavily relying on her husband at the time. His new job was supposed to change their lives, but now she was a widowed single mother, raising 3 children in a state away from all of her family and friends. After some time, she appealed to the courts to receive a death certificate, but they refused. She was told that they could not prove that her husband was dead, and they had experienced many instances where people had faked their own death so that their spouse could receive their life insurance. Horrified, Mrs. Male begged them to release the money, but they refused. She sent the tissue left over from the shark attack to a medical lab to confirm the identity of the deceased, but at the time the medical technology was extremely underdeveloped. As a result, they were unable to verify that Ray was in fact dead, and his widow was left alone and on welfare to raise her children. One man may have died, but the lives of 4 others were changed forever. The family were forced to move away from Hawaii and return to Montana to live with relatives for support. Their family was tragically destroyed by the tiger shark attack that resulted in Ray Male Jr.'s terrifying final affliction. When people know that there are great white sharks where they plan to swim, they will usually change their minds. The idea of coming face to face with one of the world's most fearsome predators is usually enough to keep someone on the shore. Sometimes, though, personal circumstances and familial obligations force people into dangerous circumstances, and so the risks must be faced. For a community in South Africa, one of the only ways to earn money for their families is for young men to free dive in shark-infested waters in search of abalone. These marine snails are highly sought after and fetch a high price for those who are desperate enough to hunt for them on the sea floor. The practice is illegal, and so the hauls must be sold on the black market to avoid persecution, but sell for big money across the world, more than $200 a kilogram in China. Trafficking syndicates would export 50,000 tons at the height of the abalone trade, leading to the animals becoming endangered, which only increased the demand and price. Unfortunately for such a high reward, the risks are much higher, as Sivuyele Zalela found out in 2017 when he tragically dived his last dive. Sivuyele was 34 years old, with a new wife and a baby on the way. Opportunities in Ilexowene, the small coastal town to which he moved, were few and far between, and he quickly trained to become an abalone poacher to keep his family going. He knew what would happen to them if he didn't earn any money, and was determined to support his family to his fullest ability. On September 3rd, he prepared for another hunting trip with a large group of other poachers. They would first have to swim more than 3 kilometers offshore to harvest the snails at Dyer Island, but they knew the dangers that awaited them. The island was a hot spot for great white sharks, and there had already been several attacks in the months leading up to their trip. They had already lost friends to the jaws of this animal. They believed that if they swam in a large group, they would have safety in numbers to protect them from being picked off in the vast open ocean. In order to reach the island, they would have to leave the relative shelter of the kelp beds and would venture across a deep channel known for its high populations of sharks waiting below the surface. They prepared for the long and arduous journey ahead of them, not realizing that they would soon lose a vital member of their party in just a few hours. As they set off, Sivuyele took the lead and swam near the front to guide the others. He'd been doing this for 8 years now and was a seasoned poacher. After about an hour, the men were chatting as they swam, trying not to think about what could possibly be swimming around just below their feet. They knew that once they got to the area filled with abalones, they would be diving for around 3 hours to ensure that the payoff was worth the risk. Sivuyele thought of his growing family and how he needed to provide for them and keep them safe. Unfortunately, this thought would be cut short. Without warning, he disappeared under the waves. He had no time to take a breath and suddenly felt an extreme pain in his legs. He knew he was in trouble. Looking down, he could see a huge great white shark gripping his legs and pulling him downwards. He didn't have much time. He started to punch the animal in the face to loosen its grip on him, but nothing would dissuade the shark from its next meal. He felt his direction change and suddenly he was back on the surface. He would have been relieved if he couldn't still feel the shark latched onto his legs. That's when the shark decided enough was enough and began to shake Sivuyele furiously, much to the horror of his friends as they watched him helplessly. He looked like a rag doll, like the chew toy of a playful puppy. He stood no chance against the raw power of this animal. The poachers scattered, knowing that there was nothing to be done and not wanting to be next. They could hear his agonized screams for help, but they swam away, knowing he would soon be dead. He clung to life for as long as he could and continued to try and fight off the animal, but he was growing weaker by the second as his blood spilt out into the water around him. He slowly began to fade away and succumbed to the might of the predator. After just a few seconds, the shark let go of Sivuyele, and he slowly floated back to the surface. The other poachers cautiously watched him bobbing in the water as his blood surrounded them, sending them into a panic as they thought the shark would now come for them. One poacher was able to call for help using a phone that they kept with them, wrapped in a plastic wrap for protection. They begged for rescue boats to come and save them, fearing that they would all become the next victims of the shark's ravenous hunger. The boats assured them that they were on their way, but now they had to wait, near enough to Sivuyele's body to know exactly what would happen if they took too much time. Within 30 minutes, they were on the boats, calling to their rescuers to retrieve their friend's body. They had not been able to confirm whether he was alive or not, but judging by the amount of blood in the water and the lack of movement, they assumed the worst. Their suspicions were confirmed when Sivuyele's body was pulled from the water, pale from blood loss due to the massive wounds on his legs. They had no choice but to bring his body back to shore and alert his family, who were now forced to provide for themselves. Ilexowene was a small but tight community, so once the news of Sivuyele's body was announced, plans were made to support his family during such a tragic time. They knew that his body had to be returned to his wife so that he would be able to be laid to rest, but now they would have to organize the transport. A week after the attack, 40 residents traveled 100 kilometers to his hometown to pay their respects. His coffin was placed into a trailer behind a minibus taxi, and they traveled with their friend, determined to get him back to where he belonged. Once they arrived with his body, arrangements were made for his funeral, which was attended by many people from his village and his new home. As part of his wishes to have a traditional Kosa funeral ceremony, 2 cattle and several sheep were slaughtered in his memory to honor him and his sacrifice. After the funeral, his pregnant widow didn't know what she should do. In her culture, her husband was expected to work and provide for the family, but now she was all alone with a new baby on the way. She needed some support. She decided to stay in Eastern Cape and move back in with her family so that they could care for her in such a dark time in her life, and then eventually help her with the baby as well. This left an empty home in Ilexoweni, so a relative of Sivoyile decided to move there instead, ultimately joining the same trade that had killed him. There's something particularly eerie about someone being killed in a job and their empty house being taken by someone who is also replacing them in the same job, like history is cursing them to repeat itself. Although these people are aware of the risks, it is clear that the desperation to avoid poverty is much higher than their own self-preservation and will undertake any job to avoid it. These men know that it is not just themselves that they are providing for, but their families too, their wives, children, and aging parents. They are forced to face the terrors of the great white sharks patrolling the waters, as the sharks wait for someone to leave the protection of the group and swim out alone. The population of South Africa suffers from a huge social crisis where more than half of the country lives in poverty and struggles every day to put food on the table. Without these abalone poachers, many families would die of starvation, a fate that these men are working hard to avoid. Despite these terrible conditions, there is little suggestion that they will change anytime soon, and eventually another poacher will be taken away from his family and dragged into the depths by another fearsome shark, bringing them to their terrifying final affliction.